We have federal members and we have non-federal members. And the STEM group is not that old, and we're trying to look at how we can take some specific concrete action to advance STEM in the Arctic. We encourage STEM to be broad and including non-STEM type activities. So glad to see that you've joined us, Sai, from an art perspective. I think that's important as well. And we have had a few activities going on that are trying to get us sort of a platform to operate from. And one of those is the Arctic STEM workshop that was held in April of 2021 in a virtual format. And we're going to just give a quick report out on that. Then we're going to turn to the Smithsonian, and they are going to talk about their STEM specific education efforts in the Arctic. And then we'd like to open this up to a discussion among everyone. We're trying to kind of like zero ourselves in on what is something that we can do in a coordinated fashion among federal and non-federal partners for advancing STEM in the Arctic. So that's kind of the aim we're trying to make in this conversation at the end. To try to identify that in a little bit more specific way, we can get our hands around something and move it forward. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the Arctic Workshop report, and then we're going to turn it over to Dawn, Aron, and Bill, and then open up that discussion. But if you could pull up the slides for the Arctic Workshop, we'll give you a synopsis of what happened there. It was originally designed to be an in-person workshop in April 2020, and for obvious reasons that did not happen. So it moved through a lot of work from a steering committee to a virtual format that occurred in April of 2021. And the report that you have in your materials and online in the IARPC site was just released in October. So we're going to go over that just briefly. If you could advance to the next slide, please, Liz. So there were 73 participants from a broad range of constituencies, students, federal agency representatives, researchers, Indigenous faculty and community members, academics, rural community members. It occurred over 3 days. It actually worked quite well in a virtual format, considering some of the challenges of bringing community into that in the Arctic. The background basis was 4 listen and learn sessions, which happened in the spring of 2020. And information was collected from those. They were distributed across different places in Alaska and different forums, and synthesized into some background material that formed the basis of the approach and the kinds of questions to be asked of the group in this workshop format. But essentially the objectives were looking at how we can increase rural and Alaska Native undergraduate and youth participation in existing STEM programs, and then what we can do differently with new approaches to support student engagement in a non-traditional format or innovation on existing traditional formats. If you could advance to the next slide, please, Liz. So the guiding themes from the listen and learn session were these. You can see quite a range of things here, most of them probably not entirely surprising. They frame the different subcomponents of the workshop that then produced the recommendations that we came to at the end of the workshop. Next slide, please. So the workshop recommendations, which are articulated in the report that you have, come under 7 themes. So there are different components to each of these themes, but we can, take these as the overarching ideas that came out of the workshop, and you can look at the details in the report that fall under each of these themes. So increasing early exposure to STEM was one of the themes, and I don't think that we're necessarily positioned to tackle that in terms of K to 12 or community-based programs necessarily. So, there are some things that I think we can do as an Arctic STEM IARPC team, and some that will be more left to others. So the second one was looking at STEM more broadly to capture a wider group of students, and some input to that is that STEM, as we think of it in a traditional academic sense, is not necessarily going to capture everyone in the Arctic, and how can we think about the traditional STEM and the pieces that intersect with the traditional STEM. The third and the fourth themes are intersected with some of the direction that we have from the IARPC principles. So those are high-level agency representation in IARPC as a community who look at the overall direction of IARPC and have made an endorsement of specific recommendations that the federal team of IARPC STEM made to those principles. I think it's now almost 2 years ago. So number 3 is redefining our program objectives and success, ensuring that those are relevant to the students and their communities. Lisa will talk about the IARPC principles recommendation, and you can see that intersection. And the fourth one, drawing on partnerships with multiple sectors and organizations, is also something that intersects with the interests of the IARPC principles. Next slide, please. Theme 5 was shifting power to the students and communities. So I think that also connects with how we think about the new and innovative aspects of IARPC STEM is not necessarily driven from an academic hierarchy, but perhaps more community driven, or at least as the suggestion is shifting some of that power towards that aspect rather than the traditional aspect. Removing hurdles to participation, there are many. Some of them are logistics, some of them are systemic. That one probably needs to be whittled away at over time. Some of them may be easy, some of them not so easy. The final theme that came out of the workshop was to respect and include Indigenous ways of knowing and being within the STEM umbrella. So these 7 themes, I think, give us something to move forward within this group of STEM interested folks in the Arctic and practitioners, and they intersect with the principles recommendations, which Lisa is going to talk about. If we can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Kaya. So the workshop is informing our next steps, and also the second piece of the puzzle is the the instructions from our principals. So we had 5 goals that were approved by the principals, who are basically the heads of the federal agencies that we work for, like the head of the National Science Foundation and NASA and the other members, and it's coordinated by the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So we have to coordinate with CoSTEM, which is another OSTP committee that's concerned about coordinating education nationally. Our goal is also to create an online guide to high school and undergraduate internships for programs for students. Number 3 is to identify and connect STEM education programs that contribute to structured ongoing support of rural and Alaska Native students. So this is one that we're going to focus on pretty closely in the coming year, and develop a cross-agency program that will engage rural and Alaska Native communities to identify community issues that can be addressed and to connect the communities to STEM professionals. So this one, number 3 and number 4 are the ones that we're really thinking of focusing on in the next year. Number 5 is to develop a cross-agency mentorship training courses for federal staff and contractors who are working in the Arctic to ensure that they are more effective and culturally relevant, anything that we do. And that has sort of been taken on by the Irpic staff already. And if you have questions about that, you can ask Liz. Next slide, please. So our next step is to this meeting, and what we want to do is to again advance the recommendations from the workshop, advance the recommendations from the principals, and then we want to coordinate with CoSTEM on anything that's Arctic relevant. And next slide, please. And so what we'd like to talk about today is ideas to develop a process to coordinate among all these federal initiatives for Arctic STEM, and particularly for the internship programs. And also the workshop report had an appendix in it, which listed many programs, not all of them by any means, but federal and state and non-fed that are ongoing in the Arctic. And so it can give you an idea of the sorts of programs that we're thinking of trying to coordinate between. And we want to come up with a process for figuring out how to do that sort of coordination. And we also want to be able to address the workshop recommendations by creating partnerships with multiple sectors. And we also want to ensure that the measures of success are relevant to the students and communities. So we don't want to continue with things that haven't been working as well in the past. We want to make sure that we can engage the students and the communities. And I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Kaya.
Thanks, Lisa. So I think we can move on to the presentation from the Smithsonian, and then we'll come back to opening up that as a broader conversation with the reference point from the last slide that Lisa just covered. So I'll turn that over to Dawn, Aron, and Bill.
Okay, well, I had offered to give a kind of an overview from the Washington, D.C. point of view. But it's going to be very short, and I started to look around for maybe preparing a slide with opportunities and things like that at the Smithsonian, and I got overwhelmed by the number of opportunities that are out there. So I'll just say that the Smithsonian, is a huge organization with many different bureaus and museums and offices, and each one of these entities has their own fellowship and internship programs, and then there are some that are centrally Smithsonian. So those are classically the pre and postdoctoral fellowships and the senior fellowships and things like that. But all the different institutions at the SI have locally based intern programs, and within these museums there are programs like the Arctic Studies Center where we do a lot of this work ourselves with students, mostly interns who drop in on us in various ways. And there's we have an advertisement out in the Smithsonian, generally opportunities areas to let people know that we're there and we're interested in people to help us with, for instance, the publication of our newsletter or exhibits or other projects. So the Smithsonian is almost like a nationally centered university with a strong bent towards objects and museum programs and things like that. So we don't offer courses or things like that, but we have tremendous numbers of opportunities. And in the Arctic, it's largely falling to the Arctic Studies Center to arrange these things. Usually we don't have any funding for interns, and For fellowships, we do, of course, but for interns, we haven't been financed well enough to be able to offer internship opportunities, but we do mentoring activities, and we offer many, help to all the students and interns who come to work with us, giving them letters of recommendation and helping them with their future career planning and things like that. In terms of specific projects, at the moment we have touring the Narwhal exhibit, which we produced a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago at the Natural History Museum, and that show closed and now has been passed to Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit Service, which is touring it around, and it's out in Salt Lake City now, and it's going to 6 or 7 other locations, some in Alaska, some in Canada, and the lower 48. So that opportunity, as it goes around, there's the museums that show that will have, opportunities for students to come and connect with that project. We're also developing a Boreal forest exhibit, which is a very general exhibit about the role of the boreal forest in our planet, featuring primarily North America. And the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit Service is also developing that as an exhibit that will open in a couple of years, and we'll also travel around. And I forgot to mention the Narwhal show. We are beginning to plan an Indigenous tour, a smaller version of that show, excuse me, that would go to smaller locations in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and particularly focusing on Canada, which we haven't had much opportunity to work with. So that will engage the Inuit communities and give us a chance to reach out much deeper than we've been able to do in some of the other exhibit projects. So that's sort of an overview of where the institution is in the Arctic in terms of STEM. We at the Arctic Study Center are a mixture of ethnographers and archaeologists, and Igor Krupnik is an ethnologist and very involved with Alaska Native people, particularly in the St. Lawrence Island area. And he's also a great expert on Russian Native peoples and also Canada and Greenland. So Igor works with students and has had interns working on publication projects. Stephen Loring is working in both the Aleutians and in Labrador on community archaeology programs, working with students, taking them into the field and working out training programs for them. And I'm currently working in the lower North Shore of Quebec, and I have a number of students who work with me in those areas when we can actually get into the field, which we haven't been able to do recently. So I guess that's an overview of where we're at. And I think, we'll turn it over to Aron and Dawn. I don't know who wants to go first, and then we'll try to get into some of the discussion of your points, in the latter part of the hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill.
So thanks. Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's a great lead in. Could we try sharing screen? I do have some PowerPoint.
Aron, go ahead. You should have access.
You should have a button at the bottom. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, and let me.
And while Aaron's doing that, I see we have Vladimir Alexiev, who's joined us, he's an Arctic climate scientist at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and has also had RU programs through NSF.
Aron, you just need to hit the play button in the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah, it was covered up by the.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
There we go. Can you all see that okay now?
We can.
Great. Well,
yes.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to present on our collaborative work in field research, exhibitions, and education. And we really are very interested in connecting with IARPC on STEM education and are looking for ways to leverage our resources and programs in that direction. And we gratefully acknowledge that the Alaska office of the Arctic Studies Center is in Dena'ina Eknana, the homeland of the Dena'ina people. And for the work at Yakutat, I'll mention and acknowledge our invitation to work there and permission to work there from Yakutat Kwan. So I'll just give a brief overview first of our community-based field research. Currently, NSF-sponsored collaborative project at Yakutat in Southeast Alaska. And this is on the relationship of the community to the ecosystem of Yakutat Fjord over the last 1,200 years as the glaciers retreated. And a key aspect of that is hunting seals, harbor seals at the glacial ice flows at Hubbard Glacier, which you can see in the background of this slide. And there's been a strong focus on recording oral knowledge, both of the human history of the fjord and the traditional ecological knowledge. This is the late George Ramos pointing out a seal hunting camp near the glacier. And many wonderful interviews with elders, hunters, and cultural leaders in the community for this project. And we also were able to involve many students, both from the community and from universities around the country, to participate in the archaeological field research, where we were going to revisit some of these old villages and sealing camps, which were known in oral tradition, but had not been rediscovered and investigated archaeologically. And that turned out to be immensely productive. And made a special effort to work with Indigenous students in our field work. This is on another project in Kenai Fjords National Park on the Kenai Peninsula. Norma Johnson, Uzatna, and Ivana Ash, who's Sukpiak, were helping us look for sites in that area. And also done quite a lot of work in coordination and in collaboration with Sukpiak communities in that region. Here we are excavating at an old village site from about 1800 AD, so Russian contact period. And we have also, in many of the field projects, also worked with high school students, which poses special challenges for field work, but we have always worked with community chaperone and coordinator who comes out with the students to engage in the field work. And this is just fishing on the day off, but it's really, that was a great group. Well, I want to move to kind of the main topic that Dawn will continue as well, and that's on our museum-based programs, and which are, focus on the Alaska collections at the Smithsonian, and the process of going from collections to communities. And we'll be talking quite a bit about that. Specifically, I want to say a bit about the exhibition, collaboratively developed exhibition in Anchorage at the Anchorage Museum, Living Our Culture, Sharing Our Heritage, the First Peoples of Alaska. It's been in place since 2010. We've had over 3 million in-person and online visitors, extensive outreach to Indigenous communities statewide, and we are increasingly working with Alaska schools through our digital projects, including Learning Lab. And this is a cross-Smithsonian collaboration, as well as one within Alaska and National Museum of Natural History, which is where our program is based, and National Museum of the American Indian worked on this closely together. And the Anchorage Museum has been our host since 1994. They made a major investment in creating the exhibition, and they collaborate with us on our educational programming. And then we'll be talking a bit about the collaborations in creating the exhibit, in studying the collections, documentation of Indigenous knowledge, and then programs that focus on traditional arts, heritage, and languages. And you'll hear about the media production and digital learning resources. And for us at the Smithsonian, this is one of our major efforts on building diversity, equity, and inclusion because of the extensive involvement and outreach to Indigenous communities. Well, I just wanted to maybe start with the roots of the Living Our Cultures project. From the opening of the ASC's Alaska office in 1994, I focused on the goal of bringing Alaska Native heritage items back to Alaska for access by source communities. And that started with the Sharing Knowledge Project in 2001, which brought 7 Alaska Native delegations to Washington to document and select the pieces for the exhibition. And these are Nungaak scholars working at the Smithsonian, looking at Aleutian Island Shield. And these are Tlingit community scholars who were involved. And this is just another example. This Inupiaq parka was collected for the Smithsonian during the first International Polar Year in 1881. It was selected for the exhibition and by the Inupiaq advisors and is now in Anchorage. And these consultations were videotaped, transcribed and translated. There are over 4,000 pages of expert commentary in English and Indigenous languages, and this is tremendous source material for our programs. The first outcome of the effort was the Sharing Knowledge website, which includes object photography, historical and contemporary images, and those transcripts of elders' commentaries and curatorial documentation of the pieces. So there were over 600 objects in the exhibition and even more on this website, where it's a very highly used and accessible educational resource. So after the kind of research phase of working in Washington to select the pieces for the collection, we went through a very stimulating 3 years of collaborative exhibit design. This is the advisory committee working on the project in Anchorage. And a lot of the whole way that the exhibition shaped up came out of those recommendations from the committee. So the gallery is organized geographically, so presenting Alaska Native cultures from south to north in these 7 large 2-sided cases. And this layout allows free exploration by visitors and discovery of connections and contrast between adjacent traditions. And the presentation really emphasizes Indigenous art, knowledge, and design as embodied by the heritage objects. It's a exhibit that's about self-representation, multivocality, and oral knowledge are really brought to the fore, including in the exhibition catalog, which was published by Smithsonian Books. And there's touchscreens that link to the object information on the Sharing Knowledge website. And a really interesting part of this project is that the case and mount designs allow the objects to be removed from the cases for community consultations. And we have a community consultation room adjacent to the gallery. And here you see some of the pieces being moved into that area for, in this case, it was a Dena'ina language workshop where they were talking about the objects. There was an interesting and unusual phase of collaborative conservation and exhibit preparation in Washington before the pieces even came up to Alaska. So we were seeking advice on repairing and restoring some of these objects. And this is Elaine Kigikuk from St. Lawrence Island repairing a seal intestine parka that's in the exhibit using traditional methods. So the exhibition opened in 2010 at the Anchorage Museum. And our secretary at the time, Secretary Huff, and leadership from NMNA, from National Museum of Natural History and National Museum of the American Indian attended. And the exhibitions really has deep community roots, and it created a sense of Indigenous ownership and pride in partnership with the Smithsonian. And I just threw in this quote from Elaine Abraham because I I feel that it really speaks to the tremendous value that is seen in these pieces and in their return to Alaska, where they're now accessible. So since 2011, the ASC has hosted exhibition-based programming that's focused on Alaska Native arts, heritage, and languages. And Dawn will be saying more about these programs. I'll mention them briefly. Material Traditions program includes week-long residencies at the Arctic Studies Center for teaching traditional arts, such as snowshoe building. Outreach to the public schools is an important part of these events. And the senior artists mentor younger artists, and part of their learning involves studying pieces in the exhibit collection. In this instance, an Aleutian bentwood hunting hat from NMAI. This is mounted on a study cart in the consultation room. We've done 17 museum and community-based programs as part of this series since 2011. And I'll just mention a few before turning it over to Dawn. They've included looking at the process of making clothing and bags from salmon skin, starting with the complete fish and going through the whole process during the residency. This is working on sewing seal intestine clothing, carving of walrus ivory. So these are all demonstrated and with a great deal of public outreach. This is carving cedar, masts and musical instruments, weaving cedar bark baskets, and this was the tanning, sewing, and beading moose hide in 2017. And this was another more recent one, making grass baskets from tundra grass. So Dawn will talk about the fact, the way that she documents all these projects extensively on video, and then creates instructional videos that contain a lot of both technical details, but also a lot of Indigenous perspective, cultural knowledge, ecological knowledge that comes into these films. They're accessible on our YouTube channel, and then on the relatively new project called Learning Lab, which has just been up since last year. And this is specifically providing all of our digital resources, which are quite extensive, in a format for use in the classroom in Alaska or wherever. It's hosted at the Smithsonian on the Learning Lab. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn to pick up on some of these projects and talk about them a little bit more. And this specifically is the platform that I think we could work with IARPC and on developing explicitly STEM related education. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it on to Dawn. Thank you.
We go ahead and screen share. Okay, now you're not seeing my whole desktop, right?
Correct.
Okay. So I'm really glad that Aron brought up Elaine Abraham, because during the opening, she quietly took me aside. You know, there was just hundreds of people there. She quietly takes me to the corner of the gallery and goes, "I hope you know, Dawn, that you all have done really good work, but your work is just beginning." And that was really great, because that was, you know, a clear goal of us working together with all of the Alaska Native experts from across the state for almost 10 years. And ever since the exhibition opened, you know, we wanted to really make the best of those really rich resources that Aron was talking about. And, you know, they came through starting out with the Sharing Knowledge website that Aron talked about, which was available online even before the exhibition opened. And that website has all of those detailed edited transcripts, summaries of historical literature, quotes from elders, archival images, high resolution object photographs, and all of that was available online. And in those interactives that you saw in the exhibition, an iteration of that was there as well. And what's been great about that is over the years, especially graduate school and college level classrooms at the University of Alaska have been really making strong use of those resources. And to some extent, you can create resources, and the most important part is outreach. And that's, I think, an issue for all of our work. And that's something that over the years we've been really able to expand again and again through, having these long-term community relationships. And in addition to this, website, we had this great exhibition that opened, and part of that exhibition really featured a lot of the content from the website, but it also featured a lot of new writing by our Alaska Native collaborators. All the exhibit text for the most part was written by Alaska Natives, the primary and secondary labels, the highly featured ones that when people go into the gallery, they see that first. They also see the high resolution contemporary photographs that our Alaska Native collaborators selected with us. So when people go into that space, when Alaska Natives go into that space, they really feel like it's relevant to them, that it represents their life and, today, as well as all those connections to the past within their community, the present and the future of their community. And that's part of really what made the springboard of this exhibition work for us to continue these community collaborations. Another part of the exhibition was this publication, the exhibition catalog, and it features essays written by Alaska Native experts. And luckily we figured it out literally, I think, 2 months before COVID hit, that we, in order to continue on this path of community engagement and community relevance and accessibility, we wanted to make as much of these resources available for free online in one place. And that turned out to be Learning Lab, which Aron showed you, and I'll speak about a little bit more. Some of those programs that we continued, and Aron mentioned some of these, really built on this, 10 years of working with Alaska Native communities to build the exhibition. And we maintain those relationships that we built. And that's the important part, is that the relationships are relationships of trust that you need to build over time and that you need to continue through time. So by working again with people that we worked with on the exhibition, and here you can see Merlin Kanuka, this gentleman back here, we worked with him on the exhibition, and then we worked with him to help meet some of the people that you see pictured here who participated in this language seminar. And this was one of the first sets of work that we did to have this ongoing community collaborative research and documentation. And we made sure that it was relevant to communities because we worked with them to develop it and to determine that language documentation and creating some educational units for use in the classroom, that was an important goal for Alaska Native communities. And we were able to support that together. And it all was based on a starting point of the objects that were in the exhibition, because as you know, or as you may have experienced, museum heritage pieces in museums are really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kind of knowledge that they represent. I'm really glad that Sai's here, because I think he'll agree with me that STEAM really could have a letter A in there for the arts. It really could be, I called it STEAM instead of STEM, because, working with Alaska Natives and Indigenous peoples, you realize that, at times everything is about language. That's the basis for so many things and so much knowledge. But also the arts really incorporate science and interdisciplinary sciences, especially for harvesting and processing materials and knowing when to do that. So connecting museum pieces to the arts, to the sciences, it really makes things much more relevant to community members and much more relevant in the Arctic to Alaska Native, especially youth, because it's things that are familiar with them, that are part of their heritage. And it gets them really excited about learning, and it can be a really strong platform for then going even further past the art form itself and into the, the scientific principles that are behind that have been really developed over generations of knowledge that's been shared. And so, as Aron mentioned, we shifted our focus from language onto historical art forms and present day art forms based on feedback from the communities that we've worked with. And we worked with a lot of different kinds of materials. And it first started out that we had artist residencies in Alaska and gave people a chance to study museum objects up close and in person, which was really important to be with those objects in person. And part of it was that some of these things, like working with fish skin, or as you see here in the middle, working with porcupine quill, people couldn't find elders or experts in their communities that knew how to work with these materials because they had been replaced by other materials across time. And they needed the opportunity to study museum objects, to reverse engineer how these materials were worked with. And then they needed time together with other artists, which they rarely had a chance to do given the geographic distances of Alaska, to again try to reverse engineer how do you process these materials, how do you make them stabilized, how do you actually make something from it. And we'd bring artists together, often from different culture groups interested in the same materials, and they would, experiment together during these workshops. And then another important part that Aron showed you is that we'd bring in classrooms of Alaska Native students and just general students from grade schools in the Anchorage area to see these artists at work and to get excited about this kind of interdisciplinary learning and museum-based learning. And we were able to expand our program to include, as you can see here on the lower right, harvesting materials in communities and then having workshops in communities. And we also brought in, as you can see here on the upper right, and Aron showed you a picture of this as well, we would bring in artists that would learn from the Alaska Native experts. And we'd also even invite just local artists to drop by and visit these workshops to also glean information. So we were really supporting intergenerational learning. Aron showed you a picture of some people working with moose hide, some Athabascan ladies, and they were actually all part of the same extended family. So we were supporting and have been supporting family learning. And these are, really important ways to make learning both accessible and relevant to communities, because that's a traditional way of learning within Alaska Native communities. And as Aron mentioned, part of the goal of the project wasn't just to create these one-time opportunities for people to learn that, happen to be able to participate in our programs. We really wanted to invest in creating together really extensive documentation of the of both the Indigenous context for this kind of learning, but also the actual techniques for this kind of learning, not to replace learning from artists or elders, but to allow students to prepare for learning, those kind of learning opportunities, or to have taken a class and go back to these resources and have a chance to practice this art form and learn this art form more. And then also to have that opportunity to have that, Alaska Native tradition of trial and error, of experimentation, of learning from your mistakes. That's, really important in terms of any kind of practice. And we've also, in addition to having that community engagement by involving community members, we reach out to communities and develop these projects to make sure that they're relevant for community members. And then often we're able to support the people that we've partnered with. And we were able to help the organization that we partnered with here get the Hayek Foundation to get a grant through one of their regional institutions to create this bilingual guide. And then we were able also to help edit that and to promote it and have it be available online. And later on, we were able to continue that relationship like we do with many of them. And Bill mentioned this as well. We also help write letters of recommendations for students for artist residencies or graduate schools, but we also help organizations that we've partnered with to develop their own projects after they've had a chance to work with us and learn how we manage projects, and then that helps them train up to produce their own, and we can write letters of support for that as well, and have done that. And Aron mentioned Learning Lab, and as I said, luckily just prior to COVID, we were able to develop a project to really bring all of our educational resources online in one place. And Aron showed you a YouTube channel, but as you might know, YouTube allows you to post videos, but it's very hard to congregate information in groupings to have different types of information available. And that's really important to our work, just because our work is interdisciplinary and involves different types of media. So Learning Lab was an opportunity for us to really utilize a free platform, and it's a platform that anyone can use. You can bring in any resource that's digitized at the Smithsonian, but also bring in any resource of your own that you want to share. So here was a place where I started work on bringing in Alaska Native information from the exhibition. And I'll show you something later on that gives an example of that. And it starts out with overviews of Alaska Native culture. And again, this is bringing those, basic education resources from the Sharing Knowledge website, which I think is almost 15 years old now and is about to expire due to technical changes. But to bring this all into another place where it can live a longer life. And I was also able to sort out that Learning Lab can be made a lot more complex and rich in content than you can see for a lot of other entries. So I was able to create 4 different types of categories of information. This general information about Alaska Native cultures. During COVID, I've been able to work on creating distance learning units, and I'll get into that next too. And all those material traditions videos and associated information were able to go into the community videos section. And then we have this ongoing program called Conversations. That's a partnership with the Inuit Art Foundation. It's a series of webinars on issues that are important to Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And so, for example, that first section about Alaska Native cultures, it enables us to bring in, focused information about each Alaska Native culture and provide contemporary images, archival images, rich information about objects, and the essays that are from the exhibition catalog. And all of these can be downloaded so that they can be shared. And what it also enables us to do is to bring in, for each of the objects that we show, we can update the relatively limited standard museum object collection information and really indigenize that and make it better scholarship and rich scholarship, because it's coming from Alaska Native peoples, the first experts about these objects, and brings in those rich elder discussions that Aron talked about. So right away we're making this information more relevant and more interesting, not just to Alaska Natives, but to any kind of a visitor looking to learn more about Alaska Native cultures. And then here you can see the different community videos that we were able to work on and to continue working on during COVID, actually. And for one example, I luckily had in the can some footage that was filmed for carving Alaska Native whistles, and they're specifically from the Southeast region, Tsimshian, Haida, and Tlingit. And so I was able to work on this while working from home, but more importantly, we were able to write additional grants in order to have a online virtual workshop and write additional grants and get more partnership regionally, because we do try to partner with Indigenous organizations for all of our projects to have that extra collaboration, but also to have that extra outreach. And for this one, we partnered with the Alaska Heritage Institute, and we split the cost of having a set of 4 basic carving tools made for each student and cedar blocks, which were sent to each student in the workshop. And Alaska also helped us promote the workshop to have students participate. And, saying before the webinar began that, we've always tried very much, here in the Arctic to really work on outreach. And by having our programs be both in Anchorage and then in Alaska Native villages, we were able to do some of that. It's, of course, very expensive with all the travel costs. And I'm sure, as all of you know, as Arctic researchers, about that expense. But what we've really learned now during the restrictions because of COVID is that doing things online is now going to be a part of our work moving forward from now on, because it's really enabled us to increase our community outreach and our community collaboration. And here you can see students that are from Anchorage, Hoona, and I'm forgetting the other villages in Alaska, but we're able to reach a lot more places in Southeast than we would have been able to if we had done this in person. And an important part of that is that, people live busy lives and they want to, reconnect with our culture and learn more about, the art practices. And by having a workshop online and by accommodating their schedules, I flexed my hours and worked weeknights and weekends to host this workshop. We really were able to engage a lot more people. And that was, a really important, successful element in this project. And so by having this online platform and learning lab, not only could I place those videos, I could also place, as you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, technical diagrams for carving that I was able to work on with John Hudson, who is the master Simpson artist featured here. We were able to do an extra, troubleshooting video over the Zoom platform, which is just fine for recording and then editing. And then he decided he wanted to talk about some of the whistles he'd seen in the Smithsonian collection. And these are photos he took when he did that research in around 2014, because we remembered them so well. So we were able to record short videos over Zoom where he spoke about these historic pieces. So again, it's that way of making it more interesting and exciting for, Indigenous viewers, because it's someone from, their communities that are representing and talking about these objects. But it's also interesting for any sort of researcher or scholar because it's coming from an expert from the community where these objects came from. And another thing we were able to do with Learning Lab is to bring together these educational resources that we had worked on in the past. So from the language and culture seminars, and then also for some of the material tradition programs, we were able to create some educational resources. But more importantly, during COVID, we were able to create some fellowships and then also some partnerships to work with Alaska Native educators and students to create new distance learning units. And the one I'm going to feature here is that is a fellowship that we were able to get funding for. As Aron mentioned, and I think actually Bill mentioned that, we don't have the luxury of the funding to have extensive fellowships or internships, but as much as possible, we try to include those in grants or to write new grants. And a local foundation, the Siri Foundation, who's been one of our major ongoing funders, funded a museum fellowship that allowed me to bring in an Alaska Native student, Amy Topcock, who was out in Fairbanks, to work on, her plan was to eventually get back to graduate school. And so I was able to tailor a fellowship that allowed her to start working on her area of interest that she wanted to focus on for her graduate studies, which is Alaska Native design and specifically parkas. And so we were able to work on a Learning Lab unit in real time, adding resources, developing those resources, and creating new resources. So we were able to have archival images from the Smithsonian, and I worked with her to write new captions for those, so a community voice there. She was able to provide some of her own images and write for that. And then we had an opportunity to work together on getting her back in the fold for writing to prepare for graduate school. So we wrote a couple of essays about Alaska Native parkas, and were able to rework and edit a guide that she'd written for our class that she taught. And I'm happy to say she went on to apply for graduate school. I wrote her a letter of recommendation, and she's in graduate school now. And the last program I'm going to talk to you about is the webinar series, because I realized that, the Learning Lab platform in its diversity and diverse abilities was a great place to put recordings that I made over Zoom that I edited to have, make it more interesting, a couple of camera angles, some additional images and things like that, and then place them onto Learning Lab as an ongoing resource for people to refer back to. So we've had conversations on land acknowledgement, on cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation. And then we're having 6 webinars in partnership with the Inuit Art Foundation. There are 2 more this month. So if you're interested, you can send me an email and I can send you the link. And what's great about this program is that it was funded for both my time and for honorarium for the participants through the Inuit Art Foundation. And we also had a group of Inuit advisors that worked with us to select who the speakers would be and also the basic subject of the events. And then we had meetings with the participants to discuss the topics and questions that would be discussed under each subject. And I currently have my second fellow funded by the CIRI Foundation. And she, it might sound strange, she's actually a poet, but she's interested in how museums frame Indigenous knowledge in the arts and how they address audiences. So I've been able to tailor a fellowship that also relates to museum work, but that builds on her specific interests and the sort of larger issues and philosophical elements that are part of her work are really being touched on by the diversity of subjects through this webinar series. So our fellowship is focused on a bit about the project management, about running a year-long webinar series that's kind of complicated with a lot of moving parts and different speakers for each event, but also importantly, being there for these meetings where we have these really, brilliant Inuit people talking about these complex subjects and developing the content of the webinars, and then us discussing the webinars and also discussing her work, and then finding other webinars to watch online and discuss as well. So it's almost like having a graduate level one-on-one course with her that's really tailored to what her academic interests are. She's currently in a master's degree program. And
Dawn, we've reached the top of the hour. So I just wanted to give you.
That's the end of my my presentation. And, I just wanted to end in saying that I think that, we've had a lot of opportunity with our ongoing program here in Alaska and in our community partnerships to, have fellowships, internships, mentoring, and to really have a lot of community engagement and really to make our resources more accessible for community members and more relevant to them. So I really feel like we're touching on a lot of goals that were stated based on the meetings that you had for the direction that your organization is looking to go.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you all for that amazing presentation and a lot of really interesting work that the Smithsonian is doing. And I particularly hit on your comment about an Indigenous context for learning, which you are demonstrating very substantially in the work that you're doing. And I think that that does hit on a particular aspect of both the report that came out of the Arctic STEM workshop and of the IARPC principles and how we can create greater engagement within an Indigenous context. Not sort of the, come into our world and then it works this way, but how do we do some of what you have demonstrated in the kind of work that the Smithsonian is doing? So that's fantastic. I know we're at the top of the hour. If anybody has a question they want to pose, Sa, you had your hand up.
I have to hop off here in a minute, and I think I'm not sure if you guys are the right audience for this, but I guess and Ignatius had to kind of hop off as well. But just that we've developed a program for working with high school students to do kind of oceanographic instrument development, but with a very kind of low level of assumed knowledge. So the idea is that we've done this for 2 years with this group called the Sea Cadets. And so we work with high school students to develop these oceanographic instruments, and they build them, and then we deploy them in the Arctic Ocean. And we've been looking for opportunities to do that with Native groups. And we just haven't had that opportunity arise yet. And it seems like your guys' focus is really more on anthropological side, and then this is a little bit more of a traditional STEM kind of like hardware and electronics and stuff like that. But it's something that I think there's really great tie-ins if we can link that to them trying to understand changes in the ice that relate to fishing or to seal hunting or to these other kind of Native activities. So I think I kind of have to hop off, but it's just if there's a way to incorporate us in some sort of future thing, like that's a sort of piece that we have that we can kind of bring to the table.
Yeah, and Sai, I'll just respond to that quickly if you have to go
Please.
with it. You can make some good connections with the University of Alaska and Fairbanks,
Mhm.
because they are doing some of what you're talking about, and there are probably some good partnerships to be made there.
Sure.
So you can shoot me an email if you want, and put my email in here. All right, I think we need to wrap this up given the time and respecting everybody's next meeting. So Lisa and I will send out some notes from this on our next steps. And I'd particularly like to thank Bill and Aron and Dawn for giving a great presentation on the really fabulous work that the Smithsonian is doing in general and in the Arctic in particular. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, Kaya.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.